So here we're going to be talking about specifically in some more tangible ways how the public or how a local government can benefit from the provision of professional sport. One of the things when we talk about the provision of public goods or what the role of the government is in the provision of public goods is that one of the roles of government is to mitigate market failure. That means when a market is not providing enough of a good or service at a price that people are willing and able to pay, one of the roles of government is to intervene in one way or another in order to maximize the public benefit. So some ways that markets fail and governments get involved is markets might fail to provide the right amount, the right quantity demanded of a public good. Markets might cause people to use too much of a common resource. So for example, water, for example. So there might be a regular quantity demanded of water, for example, but if people are wasting water or overly consuming water, then it's the role of government, for example, to step in and correct that. This is also relates to the idea of the tragedy of the commons, and it's the role of the government to intervene and make sure that people are not over consuming more than their fair share of a particular common resource. And it's also the role of the government to step in and to mitigate market failure when markets become monopolized. In this section, you need to understand one of the most critical concepts is the idea of externalities. What is an externality? An externality is basically the uncompensated impacts of an action on a third party. So externalities occur when a firm does not take a third party into account, and it may not even know, the firm may not even know that the third party was, or that people were impacted. We have both positive and negative externalities. So let me maybe stop and give you an example of an externality. So for example, what is an externality? It's an uncompensated impact of the action of a third party. Well, we're going to talk in a second about this example, but I'll go ahead and share it with you here so you make sure you understand externalities in general. Let's say that we're going to build a new World Cup stadium, and this actually happens, right? So we're going to build a new World Cup stadium in Brazil. In order to do that, we are going to take 100,000 people that live in a particular area, and we're going to basically kick them out. Maybe we mow down a slum that is in Brazil where still 100,000 people call it home, but we're going to kick them out, and on top of their home, we're going to build this new World Cup stadium. Well, if those people that are kicked out are not compensated for that action, then there's an externality. Now, certainly those people not being compensated is a negative externality, so we're going to talk in a second about positive and negative externalities. But in my World Cup example, all those people who were displaced from their homes, regardless of how poorly their living conditions were, if they are not compensated, then that's an externality. It's an uncompensated impact on those people of the actions of a third party. Some of the characteristics of externalities is that the firm doesn't take the third party into account. That would be the case in my World Cup example. And certainly this is not the type of externality where the firm, the people building the stadium, the government probably in this case, didn't even know there was an impact. I mean, if you kick 100,000 people out of their homes, you know there was an impact. But if you don't take that into account and you don't compensate them, that is an externality, for example. And in this example, that is a negative externality. So we're going to be talking about positive and negative externalities. One of the major reasons why the public funds stadiums, arenas, or major renovation projects is that the government believes that the positive externalities will outweigh the negative externalities. If you're the government, you need to be looking at society as a whole, residents and citizens as a whole, and whether or not your city will be better off after you build this stadium or substantially renovate this stadium. And if you believe that the positive externalities outweigh the negative externalities, then you would move forward with funding the project from a public perspective. For example of negative externalities, a team plays a game. You have noise, overcrowding in the area, pollution, traffic congestion. These are all things that have a negative impact on citizens or people or on society that no one compensates them for. Okay, so it has a negative impact on bystanders, for example, people who live nearby, people who are just trying to get to a doctor's appointment, people who are just trying to get to work. There's all these negative impacts on these bystanders, and no one is compensating them for those impacts. And for that reason, it is a negative externality. We might also say that there are external costs because of, health problems, inconvenience. For example, let's say that there's a day game at Wrigley Field and I work in Chicago and I'm trying to get to work and there's so much traffic congestion, there's an accident, people trying to get to the game, trying to park. And because of that, I'm late for work. And let's say that I'm late for work and I get fired because I was late for work. No one from the Chicago Cubs is going to come along and find the person who lost their job because they were late, because of the traffic, and offer to pay them for that. Okay? So that is a negative externality. No one's compensated. It's an impact. And in this case, the Chicago Cubs probably didn't know that happened. They didn't consider it, and they also didn't know about it. And so when we're talking about providing sport as a public good, specifically talking about stadiums and renovations and construction, these are negative externalities for which no one is compensated. And these are created every time we do most anything. We have negative and positive externalities. Figure 6.5 is just showing you that there is basically a demand for, let's say, for professional baseball. There's a demand for the quantity of games along the x-axis. There's a price per game along the y-axis. And we have our regular demand curves starting high on the left and sloping down on the right towards higher quantity games at lower prices. But then we have, this figure is showing you there really are two supply curves. There's the private supply, and this is what the team would want to or does supply. Okay? They are going to supply the private supply. But in reality, when we consider externalities, there's a social supply. Okay? And when we're talking about negative externalities, you have this other supply curves. It's labeled SS. That's the supply that is ideal for society as a whole. Let's say the city of Chicago. The Cubs would want to provide the private supply, but the city of Chicago, because of negative externalities, they would want them to supply the social supply, which is actually less. When Chicago is focused on negative externalities, they want less games, which then results at a higher price. But because there are less games, there are less negative externalities, less negative social impacts on the city of Chicago, for example. And that's what this figure is showing. So firms like the Chicago Cubs have a private supply based upon the cost of their inputs, and that results in a private quantity and a private price. But as I was saying, the private supply understates some of the costs because there are costs to society that the Chicago Cubs, for example, are not even aware of. And those costs are negative externalities, and they're taken on by third parties. The firm does not compensate those third parties for those negative costs or for those additional costs. Therefore, we have this resulting social supply curve. This social supply curve includes all the costs, the private costs, the costs of the Chicago Cubs' actual inputs, what it actually costs the Chicago Cubs, but then also what it actually costs society. And the socially optimal outcome for the city of Chicago, in my example, would be the social supply, the social quantity, which is less than the private quantity, at the social price, which is higher than the private price. Why? Because when we're focused on negative externalities, that higher price and lower quantity, the lower quantity reduces the negative externalities, and the higher price would essentially compensate society for those negative externalities that are created. When we're focused on negative externalities, this is what we see. Now keep in mind, when you're the city of Chicago, you're doing a $5 million renovation or a $500 million renovation of Wrigley Field because you believe that the positive externalities are greater than the negative externalities. But here we want to clearly explain what negative externalities are and how that impacts or should impact the business of professional sport. Because in reality, the Chicago Cubs do provide the private supply at the private price. So the Cubs ignore the negative externalities. Okay, they ignore the negative externalities because they're a private for-profit firm, and it's not their job to concern themselves with social well-being or social the socially optimal. It's not their job to consider all citizens of Chicago. It's their job to consider their own bottom line in addition to their fans. So the Cubs, like any firm, are going to provide the private supply at the private price. There we go. No one's being compensated. What happens? Well, the market fails. The market fails because essentially there's a surplus of games being played, quantity private, and it's at too low of a price. It's the private supply which results in the private price. So because of that, there's a surplus. So the one thing that the government can do is they can intervene because this is a market failure. How does the government intervene? Well, they can impose a tax. They can impose a tax on any firm that produces too much and charges too little. The government comes in and imposes a tax. You know from chapter 2 that a tax results in a leftward shift of the supply curve. That leftward shift of the supply curve, this is showing you sort of one of the basic principles of taxation, is that the government can come in and impose a tax which naturally shifts the supply curve to the left because consumers are only willing and able to pay for less of that product at the higher price. Therefore, the tax, if the tax is the appropriate amount, will result in firms supplying the social quantity at the social price. Why do we want the social quantity at the social price? Well, because if you're the government, that's optimal for all citizens in society, and taxes are used in order to correct the market, in order to compensate people for negative externalities, in order to ensure that firms are not providing too much of a quantity and charging too little. Go back to my example. The guy gets fired for being late to work. Well, we have this tax now, and let's say that this tax creates less traffic on less days. Okay? But also more money is coming in because there's a tax. And the Cubs are now having to charge the social price, and that tax is coming back to the government. The government can choose anything they want to do to spend that tax. But one thing in my example they might do is they might improve public transportation. Well, this improvement in public transportation is a way that the city of Chicago might compensate those people who are negatively affected by traffic, for example. Okay? Now, conversely to negative externalities, we certainly have positive externalities. And again, cities subsidize professional sport because they believe that the positive externalities outweigh those negative externalities that we've just been talking about. So what are some of those positive externalities? For example, facilities, stadiums, and arenas can become landmarks over time, like the Boston Garden, Fenway Park. The old Yankee Stadium was certainly a landmark. Sports facilities also can bring benefits to neighborhoods in the SimCity sort of way. And also, many people who are not directly involved with the team, maybe as a fan, they're also going to benefit because they're going to see maybe income rises as a result of the construction. Maybe there are new jobs created as people work in the new stadium. And so these are some examples of some of the positive externalities. Because the public, the city, the government, the location, the local government does not compensate the team for locating in the city, these companies, businesses, people, they benefit from a positive externality. In other words, let's say that they build a new stadium in Brooklyn, and someone is hired to be the maintenance director. Okay? Well, that person has a new job, and he has a new salary and his household benefits, but he's not going to pay the team back for that. And so because of that, he is individually benefiting from a positive externality for which he does not compensate the team, which results in a social demand. Because there are positive externalities associated with professional sports teams and facilities and stadiums, we have a private demand. This is what the Chicago Cubs would want to supply at what price. And then we have this social demand. Because of positive externalities, locating a team or building a stadium is good for a city. And because it's good for a city, we want more of it. Okay? We want a higher demand. We have a greater demand for, if we're focused on the positive externalities, we have a greater demand for more games. And that's a rightward shift in the demand curve. Because there are positives associated with professional baseball being in Chicago, we want more of it if we're focused on the positive externalities. So that is a rightward shift in the demand, social demand. So social demand may be higher than private demand because there are positives associated with it. And so we have a social demand curve that lies to the right of that private demand curve. The Chicago Cubs, for example, as a producer, is going to take into account the costs and benefits, and they're going to have demand at basically this private, they face this private demand curve. This is what people are willing and able to pay, and they're going to set their price and their quantity supplied based upon their own interests. Okay? The Chicago Cubs are going to set their price and their quantity supplied based upon their own interests, just like we've been talking about throughout the entire class. And that is going to result in this private price, private quantity supplied when they face this private demand curve. However, the benefits to society might exceed the Chicago Cubs or any private team's benefits. So our social demand curve is actually, again, above our private demand because we want more of it, because it creates positive externalities. It creates positives for our residents and for our location, our city. And because it's good for Chicago, we want more of it. Now we have a different problem. If we're focused on positive externalities, the different problem is that the Chicago Cubs are going to supply too little of games played, and they're going to charge too low of a price. Well, we want more games. And because society wants more games, we have this rightward shift in the demand curve that results naturally in a social price or a higher price. Now, in reality, the Cubs, again, they're not charging, the private firm, they're not supplying the social supply, and they're not charging the social price because they're concerned with their own interests, like any private firm would be. So what happens? The market fails. The market fails because too little of this product is being produced. If we believe that there should be more of it because it's good for society, because it's good for the city of Chicago, because it creates all these positive externalities, if we believe there's too little of it, then the government can also intervene. The government intervenes in order to basically make it easier or less costly for the private team or the Chicago Cubs, in my example. Hey, we want you to have more games, and so because we want you to have more, it makes no sense for you to have more, but we're going to make it make sense. We're going to make it make sense by maybe providing you tax breaks. Okay? We're going to make it cheaper for you. We're going to reduce your costs, and because we've reduced your costs, you now can supply more. Okay? The other thing that we could do as a government is we could subsidize the product. And subsidizing the product is essentially just another way to make it cheaper. Stadiums, arenas, construction, renovation, these are the major number one subsidies that governments provide to private for-profit professional sports teams because governments believe that the positives outweigh the negatives. There is not a city in the United States that taxes a professional baseball team any differently than it taxes anybody else. There is no tax on a team being located in a city. Why? Because the city believes that the positive externalities outweigh the negative externalities, meaning the city believes this scenario is happening. The city believes that the market is failing because there's not enough. Positives outweigh the negatives. Therefore, we are going to make it easier for you to produce more, and we're going to do that by paying for your stadium, by building you a new one, or by renovating your existing one. Cities believe that new facilities generate many different forms of spending. Construction is certainly a big one. The construction or renovation of the facility, certainly that generates millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in spending. Fans tend to spend millions of dollars to enjoy a game, and that spending either in construction costs, renovation costs, greater household income, new jobs, those all spread throughout the city's economy. When we talk about these benefits that professional sports teams bring to the economy, we talk about what we're going to talk about here is direct and indirect benefits. So what are the direct benefits? The direct benefits are the direct new influx of cash, the direct new spending. So the direct benefits are the new spending that the Cubs are bringing to the table or that the team generates. New spending can come in two forms. It can cause Chicagoans to spend more than they would normally spend and to save less than they otherwise would. So essentially, let's say that generally I save 20 cents of every dollar. But because the Cubs live here, that's something that I'm willing to spend money on that I would have normally saved. And so now I spend 85 cents of every dollar and I only save 15. That's one form of new spending. If a professional sports team can encourage people in that location to spend more than they would have normally spent and save less. Most importantly, a professional sports team, in this example, the Chicago Cubs, their important role in direct benefits is to stimulate net exports. In other words, to sell their games to foreigners or people from outside the city. My cousin lives down the road. He is an avid Chicago Cubs fan. He takes his family every year to Chicago to watch 2 or 3 Cubs games. That's Chicago exporting, okay? Basically, they're selling a product to a foreigner, someone from Florida. They're selling a Chicago product to someone from Florida who is coming in and bringing in new money every year that contributes to the economy of the city of Chicago that not normally would have been spent in Chicago. Okay, so these are direct benefits. New spending by locals and then also new spending by visitors. How do we figure out what the size of those particular benefits are? We know that a family of 4 would spend approximately $300 on a trip to Wrigley Field, and that's just in the stadium. If the renovations to Wrigley were, for example, to attract 250,000 new people, it would generate over $18 million. So that is one way, that is the direct impact. If we did a major renovation to Wrigley Field, it brought in 250,000 additional fans at, let's say, $300 a pop. It would generate this $18 million in new additional spending. Now, we have to be careful because new spending is the key, okay? Those locals either need to spend money that they would have saved, new spending, or it has to be people coming in from outside. Otherwise, from an economic perspective, from the city's perspective, from the government's perspective, if you spend money at a Cubs game that you would have spent at the movies or a restaurant or that you would have spent on groceries or that you would have spent somewhere else in the city, there's no benefit. There's no net benefit. The only net benefit comes when someone, either a local or a resident, spends money in the city of Chicago that they would not have otherwise spent. So the focus has to be on new spending. It can't just be money that would have been spent somewhere else in the economy on some other activity. Teams are sort of conduits for spending, In other words, money sort of passes through them. They don't necessarily attract new money. So they bring in revenue, but they also spend. The biggest cost for professional sports teams is salaries. Professional sports players often live somewhere else. If you played for the Chicago Cubs, you probably have a house in Florida because we do not have state income tax. And so if I'm the Chicago Cubs and I pay a pitcher $100 million, well, that money basically leaves the city because he doesn't live there. He lives somewhere else. And they're not going to get the tax benefit of paying him that $100 million in terms of his income tax. This is just saying that we have to be careful, and that oftentimes a city or a government frequently overstates the benefit, the financial benefit of having a professional sports team by not considering new spending, by not considering the way that revenues also go out from the team and are essentially parked somewhere else. In reality, the direct benefits of professional sports teams is pretty small. You see here as an example, Major League Baseball as a whole generates less revenue than Fruit of the Loom. That's pretty funny. So, for example, in all, these professional sports teams like in Chicago, Denver, Philadelphia, the combined personal income associated with these teams accounts for less than 0.5% of the total personal income in that city. Oftentimes, cities and governments overstate the value, the economic, the financial value of having a professional sports team within a given city. Honestly, most of the benefits are those intangibles that we really can't measure. In terms of finance, in terms of money, the benefit is very small. So here we're going to talk about, this is an important thing that you got to get your head around, and that's about the multiplier. Okay, you have a project at the end of class that deals with the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is essentially the idea that there's the direct effect, so the new money that comes in, either by a foreigner or by a local that they would not have spent into the economy. That's the direct effect. But that money comes into the economy and it actually ripples throughout the economy. Let's say that we spend $50 million to renovate Wrigley Field and we pay it to a construction company, for example. That $50 million may be the direct impact, but that direct impact ripples throughout the economy because it's new money that came in. And whoever you gave it to, let's say you gave it to Acme Construction. Acme Construction is going to not save all that money. They're going to have to spend that money. So they're going to spend that money throughout the economy. And each time that money is respent, we call that the multiplier. Just like throwing a pebble in a lake, throwing direct spending into an economy ripples throughout the economy. Those ripples start large and they get smaller and smaller and smaller until basically they're gone. So we throw $50 million into an economy. That $50 million ripples throughout the economy until it eventually fades to basically zero. So in order to calculate the multiplier, we need to understand what happens to that $50 million when it goes into an economy in terms of direct impact. And how does some of it fade away and how does some of it continue to ripple? The way that we do that is we have the concept of the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? MPC, marginal propensity to consume. Essentially, the marginal propensity to consume is simply, if I gave you $1, let's say I gave you $100. So I give you $100. How much of that $100 are you going to spend? And how much of that $100 are you going to save? Now, when I was in college, I would have spent all of it, right? So my marginal propensity to consume would be 1. Okay? I'm going to spend $100 of the $100. Okay? Now, let's say that later on in life, you give me $100. I might now, let's say I'm going to spend 80 and I'm going to save 20. Well, my marginal propensity to consume is now 0.8 and my marginal propensity to save is now 0.2. If you broke it down to a single dollar, you could say that I'm going to save 80 cents of every dollar. If I'm going to save every 80 cents of every dollar, then my marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and my marginal propensity to save is 0.2. Okay? So this is how we can measure, or more accurately talk about, how does that $50 million ripple throughout the economy? When we're able to calculate the size of the ripples and how many ripples there are, that is basically the calculation of the multiplier. The multiplier is the idea that that direct spending doesn't stop there. It gets respent, recycled, recirculated throughout the economy. So the total effect of that $50 million is the multiple of that direct effect. The direct effect is 50 million, and then we're going to calculate how that 50 million ripples throughout the economy to create a much larger impact than just $50 million. But in order to do that, we have to know the marginal propensity to consume, how much of each dollar I'm going to spend, and the marginal propensity to save, how much of each dollar I'm going to save. When I save, I basically withdrew that money from the economy. Okay? The amount I save is basically gone. It's no longer part of the ripple. I've pulled it out and I've saved it. I'm pulling it out of the economy. Don't get super hung up on this. I'm going to focus on the example, okay? But if we're looking at a formula, we would say that the change in income is equal to the additional expenditure times 1 plus the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to consume squared plus the marginal propensity to consume to the third. Okay, this is just showing that that money keeps moving and moving throughout the economy. Just definitely focus on the example here. I just want you to understand that all these things that are happening as we're adding up these marginal propensities to consume is basically money changing hands from one person to another person to another person to another person. The simple formula for calculating the simple multiplier is that 1 is divided by 1 minus someone's marginal propensity to consume. So let's say, for example, that I said that the city of Chicago's marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. What does that mean? That means that on average, people in Chicago are going to spend 90 cents of every dollar they make, and they're going to save 10 cents. So let's calculate the simple multiplier based upon the marginal propensity to consume of 0.9. So we put 0.9 into our formula, 1 divided by 1 minus 0.9, marginal propensity to consume. 1 minus 0.9 is 0.1. 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. So then the simple multiplier in this example is 10. So if there's a direct impact, for example, of 43 million, let's say they spent 43 million to Acme Construction to renovate Wrigley Field. Well, in this scenario, if the city of Chicago's marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, then that means the simple multiplier is 10, which means that that 43 million is going to have an impact of 430 million. So Acme Construction gets 43 million, but by the time that 43 million is done rippling throughout the economy with a simple multiplier of 10, we have $430 million in economic impact. Let's look at an example. So let's say that Americans in general consume 90 cents of every dollar and save 10 cents. That means their marginal propensity to consume is 0.9 and their marginal propensity to save is 0.1. Let's say that Rachel gets a job at the stadium and she earns an extra $30,000. Okay? So $30,000 times Rachel's marginal propensity to consume 0.9 is $27,000. Okay, so Rachel is going to spend $27,000. Let's say Rachel has a job at the stadium. She gets $30,000. She's going to spend $27,000 of it, and she goes to Bob, who sells cars, and she buys a new car from Bob because she's got a new job and she's feeling good about herself. Bob's marginal propensity to consume is now the $27,000 times 0.9, and he's going to spend $24,300. And Bob just sold a car, so now Bob's happy, and he's going to go out and he's going to buy a pool for his house. And he buys this pool from Steve, and he gives Steve his $24,300. Now, Steve's marginal propensity to consume is still 0.9, so Steve, okay, get it? So now Steve is going to spend $21,870, and this goes on and on and on and on and on throughout the economy. And that's the idea of the multiplier. We have that direct impact, and then we have people spending on down the line until the ripples get smaller and smaller and the money is eventually essentially gone. In Rachel's case, we want to calculate what the multiplier is. We calculate the multiplier by doing 1 divided by 1 minus her marginal propensity to consume. So again, we would get a multiplier of 10. So we can say that Rachel's total impact, or the total impact of Rachel getting that new job for $30,000, is actually worth $300,000 in the economy. So she got a new job for $30,000, but because that new direct spending has a multiple effect throughout the economy, the total economic impact of her getting that new job is $300,000. Now, let's look at another problem where the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. All right, so marginal propensity to consume 0.8. We do calculate the multiplier, 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2. All right, and then 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. So if we had an initial expenditure of $30 million, we'd multiply that times the multiplier, 5, and we would get $150 million. This is called the simple multiplier, but because it assumes what we call a closed economy. Okay? It assumes a closed economy. What is a closed economy? A closed economy is basically, we assume that people either spend their money locally within that same economy. So in a closed economy, we would assume that Rachel is going to spend all of her $30,000 in Chicago. So all the money she's going to spend, her 90 cents per dollar, she's going to spend it in Chicago, and then she's going to save her 10 cents, and we're not really that concerned about that right now. In reality, that doesn't happen, right? In real life, Rachel is going to buy stuff on Amazon. Rachel is going to travel and spend some of her money. Rachel is going to do all of these different things, or she has the ability to do all these different things that make that money part of her $27,000 that she's going to spend. In real life, economies are not closed. Therefore, some of her money is going to leave. All right? Some of her money is going to leave. I've already said that some of her money leaves by being saved, because she saves 10 cents of every dollar. So that money's been withdrawn from the economy. But now also, some of her money is going to leave the economy because she has the ability to buy goods or services outside of Chicago, for example. The amount of money that Rachel is going to spend outside of the city of Chicago is called her marginal propensity to import. Her marginal propensity to import, when she buys something on Amazon, that money has left the economy of Chicago. It's gone. So that money can no longer be included as part of the multiplier for the city of Chicago. So because in real life economies are open, we have to calculate a more accurate multiplier, which is not the simple multiplier. This is a multiplier in an open economy. Okay? So now the multiplier formula becomes 1 divided by 1 minus her marginal propensity to save plus her marginal propensity to import. All right. So what if she had a marginal propensity to import of 0.3? So what that means is she's going to save 10 cents of every dollar, and she's going to buy 30 cents of every dollar she's going to spend on Amazon, for example. That money is leaving our economy. So order of operations, we're going to do our addition first here. Marginal propensity to save 0.3, marginal propensity to save 0.1 plus her marginal propensity to import 0.3. So we have 0.4. 1 minus 0.4 is 0.6. So 1 divided by 0.6 is basically 1.6 repeating. This is our new multiplier. So now our new multiplier becomes only 1.6. That had a major impact. I also need to point out here that this formula is the formula for calculating the multiplier in an open economy. The formula in your textbook for calculating a multiplier in an open economy is actually wrong, which is a huge mistake. It has the marginal propensity to consume right here where I have the marginal propensity to save. We use the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to import, and we add those together because we're trying to get a number of how much money leaves the economy. That's the money that she saves and the money that she buys elsewhere. Okay? So if our multiplier for an open economy now in this scenario is 1.666, what is the impact of her $30 million? It's 30 million times 1.6. 1.6, 1.7, 1.67, whatever you want to do. We talked about that players get, in real life, for a sport franchise, a large part of the franchise's cost is players' income. Players generally don't live in the area where they play. Players also are more likely to have a marginal propensity to save because their careers are very short. They are very wealthy people, but that money generally is supposed to last them. Players should have a higher marginal propensity to save. I don't know that they all do. If you've seen, Broke, you know that a lot of them have a high marginal propensity to consume, but generally players should spend less and save more. And so that this makes their ripples smaller based upon their income. And also their income leaks out of the local area because generally they don't live there or they have residences somewhere else that allow them to pay lower taxes. In real life, the multiplier effects for cities are generally closer to 1 than they are to 10. What does that mean? Again, if you're a city and you're trying to evaluate whether or not a professional sports franchise is a good investment or a good thing for you to subsidize, you have to be very careful not to overestimate the value that they're bringing in. You have to be very careful to know that you can only focus on new spending, and then once you have that new direct spending, you have to have an accurate estimate or accurate idea of what your actual multiplier is, taking into consideration people's marginal propensity to save and their marginal propensity to import. Most studies honestly don't support, most research in the field that relates to stadiums and return on investment and public subsidies of professional sports and even public subsidies of large events like the Olympic Games. Most research suggests that these large spends do not actually return very much financially for the city. And so it's really not supported that it's a good financial move for a city to subsidize professional sport. But again, there's all these intangibles that local government loves about having a professional sports team, and especially someone else not having it. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is talking about, here at the end of this section, at the end of this chapter, we're talking about interest groups, and we're also talking about the politics of how these stadiums get built. How does it come to be? And consider the dilemma of the state of Pennsylvania. So Philadelphia and Pittsburgh both wanted new stadiums. They both assume that a stadium brings in large local benefits. But regardless of whether you build wherever you build a stadium, it's going to bring slightly higher taxes throughout the entire state. And so let's assume here, to look at how the politics of this works, that there are three sets of factions of legislatures: people in the East, people in the West, and people in the Central. People in East Pennsylvania, those legislators want to build a new stadium in Philadelphia, and people in the West, they want to build a new stadium in Pittsburgh. And the people in the middle of the state, they don't want either one because they're not going to benefit directly from a stadium in Philadelphia or a stadium in Pittsburgh. So what happens? Well, the central legislatures, the people in the middle who aren't going to benefit from either, they're always going to vote no. They're always going to vote no to a stadium, whether it's in Philadelphia or in Pittsburgh. If the people in Philadelphia oppose the stadium in Pittsburgh, then it's not going to be built, because 2/3 of the people will oppose the stadium in Pittsburgh. If the people in Pittsburgh oppose the stadium in Philadelphia, then it's not going to be built because 2/3 of the legislature opposes the stadium in Philadelphia. Even if it would overall be beneficial for the state of Pennsylvania, in this scenario, there is no way to reach a consensus that builds either stadium. So we have this concept in politics of log rolling. And log rolling is essentially the idea of trading votes. If the legislatures are smart and they want to make a smart political move, essentially all that has to happen is the people in Philadelphia and the people in Pittsburgh have to agree to support each other's proposals to build a stadium. In that scenario, both stadiums are built. Okay? If they agree to do this sort of political log rolling, and instead of opposing one another, they support one another, now we have a scenario in which both stadiums are built and both people in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh benefit. So you can see here that overall, if people from the East and West support one another, they both have a net gain of $10 million. And they only have a net loss of $2 million, or they only have a loss of $2 million. Now, the people in the central region, they're going to take a $2 million loss either way. But when you add these things collectively, looking at it at the state level, you have a $6 million benefit. So this is just talking about how essentially this idea of log rolling can be a positive thing, because you went from a situation where nothing was going to be done to a situation where both stadiums would be built and both local regions would benefit. However, the people in the middle of the state that don't benefit from either, they certainly suffer, but the net gain for the state overall is positive. So I mentioned this briefly, but I'll talk about it here for a second, is that these large mega events like the World Cup, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, these are mainly touted as being a huge economic boon for the host city or the host nation because of this idea of the multiplier effect, because of this idea of economic impact, because of bringing in the new money from visitors outside of the region. And everything we've been talking about with bringing in new direct impact as well as multiplier effects is generally the rationale for hosting one of these large mega events. The research doesn't necessarily support the idea that this happens. And one of the big reasons why is because, yes, if you host the Super Bowl in Miami, does it bring in new visitors? Yes, it does. It brings new people in to Miami who are going to spend new money, and you're going to have this direct influx of cash from these new visitors. And you're also going to have the multiple effect of these new visitors' money throughout the economy. All true. What people often overlook is the idea that, for example, if you hold the Super Bowl in Miami in February, the hotels are all going to be full and there's going to be tons of tourists, but there's tons of tourists in Miami in February anyways. So are you just displacing other tourists? Are you just displacing one tourist for another tourist? Now, you remember all the controversy about holding the Super Bowl in New Jersey in February. Well, that's a different story. If the hotels in New Jersey are completely full and you have all these new tourists coming to New Jersey, listen, no one goes to New Jersey in February unless they have to. So the impact to New Jersey's economy by holding the Super Bowl in February is going to be much greater than the impact of Miami's hosting the Super Bowl in February. But oftentimes when we talk about hosting these mega events that do bring in tons of tourists and tons of new direct spending, you fail to consider the fact that that might have been there anyways. So it's that question of, does this event just displace other types of new spending that would have been in during that time period regardless? So here I'm just finishing up. It's basically the idea that, look, short and sweet of it is, financially it's not there. And again, financially it's not there for cities to have these professional sports teams. It's the intangibles. Financially, the return is not there for people to host the Olympic Games, for people to host the World Cup. Financially, it's not there. But it's the intangibles. It's the political stuff. It's the emotions. It's the feelings. It's the nationalism. It's the displaying your nation to people around the world. Things that are all very difficult to measure. All right, I'm going to conclude on that thought. Hopefully the biggest things you need to get out of this section here, you need to understand the positive and negative externalities. You need to understand the simple multiplier calculation versus calculating a multiplier in an open economy. So you have that simple multiplier, 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, and then you have that more complex, more accurate multiplier in an open economy, 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to import. Okay, these are concepts. All the material I think is important, but I'm just thinking about the assignments that you have to do and the assignments coming up and the exams that you have to do. You certainly need to understand those concepts from these chapters. Moving on to chapter 7. Hopefully you'll join me.